They called her a floating fortress, a ship so powerful that even enemy pilots whispered her name with respect. She wasn't the biggest, and she wasn't the fastest, but she was, without a doubt, the most dangerous American warship of World War II. Her name was USS Enterprise, CV-6, known among sailors simply as the Big E. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Enterprise was at sea, an accident of fate that kept her from being destroyed like so many other ships that day. Instead of burning in the harbor, she steamed through the Pacific, hunting the enemy. And in the months that followed, this one carrier would do what entire fleets had failed to achieve. She would turn the tide of the war. The story of the Enterprise isn't just about steel, guns, and planes. It's about courage under fire, about thousands of men who lived and died aboard her decks, and about how one ship became a symbol of American resilience. As smoke rose from the shattered remains of Pearl Harbor, the Enterprise's air group was already in the sky, searching for the Japanese fleet. They never found it that day, but their mission marked the beginning of a relentless pursuit that would define the ship's destiny. Within weeks, the Big E was in action. She launched raids on Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands, striking back when America was still reeling. For the first time since the attack, U.S. bombers hit enemy bases, and the message was clear. America was not defeated, but her legend was only beginning. In the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific was balanced on a knife's edge. Japan seemed unstoppable, expanding across the ocean, capturing territory after territory. Then came the Battle of Midway, a name that would echo through history. 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward Midway Island, confident in their power. They had crushed the British, the Dutch, and the Americans at every turn. But waiting for them, hidden by radio silence and American codebreakers' genius, were 3 U.S. carriers, one of them the Enterprise. At dawn on June 4, the Big E launched her planes into the sky. Pilots climbed into cockpits knowing most of them would not return. Their mission: find and sink the heart of the Japanese Navy. The first waves of torpedo bombers were slaughtered, torn apart by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It looked like a massacre, but in that moment of chaos, a group of dive bombers from the Enterprise appeared out of the clouds. Below them, they saw 3 Japanese carriers, their decks cluttered with refueling planes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the attack. The dive bombers peeled over, their engines screaming as they plunged. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. Bombs tore through steel decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. In a matter of minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning ruins. When the smoke cleared, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. The Battle of Midway became the turning point of the entire war, and the Enterprise had been at the center of it. But victory came at a cost. Her decks were scarred, her crews exhausted, her pilots lost in the sea. Yet every time she limped back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, she returned to battle even stronger. By late 1942, the war raged around Guadalcanal, a small island whose name would become legendary. It was here that the Enterprise earned her reputation as the fightingest ship in the Navy. During one brutal stretch, she was the only functioning American carrier left in the Pacific. The Hornet was sunk, the Saratoga was damaged, the Wasp was gone. The entire might of the U.S. Navy rested on one ship. Night after night, the Enterprise fought to hold the line. Waves of Japanese bombers came for her, sometimes 3 times a day. Her decks shook under the force of near misses and direct hits. Fires blazed across her flight deck, crewmen working with hoses, extinguishers, and bare hands to keep the ship alive. Admiral William Bull Halsey sent a message that echoed through the fleet: Enterprise versus Japan, the score is even. It was no exaggeration. The ship survived hits that would have sunk others. Her damaged crews patched holes with anything they could find: steel plates, wooden planks, even mattresses. Pilots landed on half-destroyed decks, skidding through smoke and fire. And still, she kept fighting. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Enterprise had participated in more major engagements than any other ship afloat. She'd lost hundreds of men and dozens of aircraft, but she had never surrendered, never turned back. When she finally limped home for overhaul, sailors across the Pacific whispered her name like a talisman. To the Japanese, she was a ghost ship, a vessel they claimed to have sunk multiple times, only for her to reappear again and again. No other warship inspired that kind of legend. She wasn't invincible, but she seemed eternal. And in war, that illusion of immortality can be more powerful than any weapon. The Big E was more than a ship. She was a symbol of endurance, of revenge, of the unstoppable will of a nation rising from the ashes. And the war was far from over, because ahead lay some of the bloodiest battles in naval history: Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, and Okinawa. And the Enterprise, scarred and unbreakable, was heading straight for all of them. The Pacific in 1943 was a battlefield without boundaries, an endless expanse of blue water and burning skies. For the men aboard the USS Enterprise, every sunrise brought a new mission and every sunset could be their last. They were tired, they were wounded, but they were unbroken. When she returned from repairs in early 1943, the Big E emerged transformed. Her flight deck was reinforced, her radar systems improved, her air group replenished with younger, bolder pilots. She was faster to launch, quicker to strike, and deadlier than ever before. But so was her enemy. Japan's Naval Air Force, though bloodied, still had teeth. The next test would come at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz, fights that would push the Enterprise and her crew to their absolute limits. At Santa Cruz, October 1942, the sky became a killing field. The Japanese launched wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes, determined to finish what they'd started at Pearl Harbor. As alarms blared and anti-aircraft guns thundered, sailors scrambled to their battle stations. The ship vibrated with power as her gunners filled the sky with steel. The first bomb struck amidships, tearing through the deck and igniting a massive explosion. Men were thrown into the air, smoke and fire consumed entire sections. But even as the flames raged, the Enterprise continued to launch aircraft. Her flight deck crews worked with bloodied hands, clearing wreckage to make room for the next wave of planes. The Japanese pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had hit her, hard, and yet she refused to die. When the smoke cleared, the Enterprise was battered and bleeding. But she had taken down enough of Japan's strike force to force a retreat. She limped away from Santa Cruz, her deck scorched, her crew exhausted, but her spirit intact. Once again, the Big E had lived up to her name. By 1943, she had fought in every major carrier battle in the Pacific and earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. warship in history. Her logbooks read like a roadmap of the Pacific Warwake Island, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the Solomons, the Marianas. Wherever the fight was fiercest, the Enterprise was there. But the measure of her danger wasn't just in her guns or planes, it was in her ability to adapt. The Enterprise wasn't just surviving, she was evolving. Her pilots developed new tactics, coordinated dive and torpedo attacks, improved radar interceptions, and night operations that changed naval warfare forever. She became the first carrier to operate effectively after dark, giving the U.S. Navy the ability to strike when the enemy least expected it. The Japanese soon learned to fear her night raids. Blacked out, almost invisible, the Enterprise prowled the seas like a predator. Her planes struck enemy convoys and airfields before dawn, vanishing into the dark before Japan could respond. By the time 1944 dawned, she had become more than just a warship. She was a legend whispered across both fleets. The men who served on her came from every corner of America: farmers from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, kids fresh out of high school who'd never seen the ocean before. They slept shoulder to shoulder in steel compartments, lived on powdered eggs and coffee, and endured heat, exhaustion, and fear beyond imagination. But they shared something that no other ship could give them, a sense that they were part of something immortal. And soon, that immortality would be tested in the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By mid-1944, the U.S. fleet was advancing westward, aiming to cut Japan off from its empire. The Japanese, desperate, launched everything they had left, a massive carrier force intended to stop the American invasion of the Marianas. On June 19, 1944, radar screens aboard the Enterprise lit up like Christmas trees. Hundreds of incoming bogies. The air was thick with tension as the word spread: they're coming. The American carriers launched their fighters in waves, Hellcats clawing into the sky to intercept the enemy. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese pilots, many poorly trained by that stage of the war, flew into a wall of American gunfire. Enterprise's fighters alone shot down dozens of planes in a single day. Pilots joked grimly that it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. In just 2 days, Japan lost over 400 aircraft and 3 carriers. It was the death blow to their naval air power. The Enterprise and her air group had helped end the era of the Imperial Navy's dominance, but even in victory, the Big E paid a price. Her air crews pushed themselves to exhaustion. Many never returned from missions over enemy waters. Their bodies were never recovered, only their names carved into plaques aboard the ship. Still, the Enterprise sailed on. Through the summer and fall of 1944, she supported the invasion of the Philippines, bombardment and reconnaissance. She struck enemy bases, convoys, and fortifications, raining destruction from the sky. Then came Lake Gulf, a chaotic, sprawling clash that became the largest naval battle ever fought. Across 4 days, nearly 300 ships and 400 Zalosan men fought in what was essentially the death throes of the Japanese fleet. Enterprise aircraft pounded enemy battleships, carriers, and cruisers. At one point, her planes helped sink the Japanese carrier Zukaku, the last surviving veteran of the Pearl Harbor strike force. It was poetic justice. By the end of late Gulf, Japan's navy was shattered beyond repair. The seas it once ruled now belonged to the Allies, and through it all, the Enterprise remained at the heart of the storm. In less than 3 years, she had been bombed, torpedoed, strafed, and nearly sunk. Yet she always came back. Her sailors began to believe she was protected by something more than luck. They called it the ghost factor. The enemy claimed her sunk so many times that even Japanese radio referred to her as the ship that will not die. But the war was not yet over. Ahead lay the bloodiest battle of them all, Okinawa, a name that would come to define sacrifice. As 1945 dawned, the Enterprise steamed toward the Japanese homeland itself. Her crew knew the end was near, but also that the most dangerous moments of the war were still ahead. She had already outlasted every carrier from the start of the war, earned the most battle stars, and destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other ship afloat. But before she could return home, fate would demand one final trial, a test that would nearly destroy her for good, and it would come not from a fleet or a bomb, but from a weapon no one had ever seen before. The year was 1945. The Pacific was closing in around Japan, and the U.S. Navy was preparing for its final, brutal push. Every mile gained brought the fleet closer to Tokyo, and closer to the desperate fury of a dying empire. The U.S. Enterprise had already seen it all: bombings, torpedoes, kamikazes, but at Okinawa she would face something different, a storm of death unlike anything the world had witnessed. In April, the Big E joined Task Force 58, the largest carrier group ever assembled. Her mission was to provide air support for the invasion of Okinawa, to suppress airfields, destroy shipping, and protect the fleet from the new threat: kamikaze attacks. The kamikaze was Japan's final, pilots who turned their planes into guided bombs, diving straight into American ships in suicidal fury. Each attack was fast, unpredictable, and devastating. On April 11, radar picked up incoming bogies. The ship went to general quarters. Within minutes, the sky filled with streaking shapes, Japanese Zeros diving out of the clouds. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, tracers arcing upward like fiery rain. One kamikaze broke through the defensive screen. The pilot, wounded but determined, aimed his plane directly at the Enterprise's flight deck. It struck with a blinding flash, an explosion that tore through the deck and engulfed everything in flames. Men were hurled across the steel surface, engulfed in smoke and burning aviation fuel. For a moment, chaos reigned. But then, like always, discipline took over. Damage control teams rushed forward, extinguishers in hand, dragging wounded men to safety. Within an hour, the fires were contained. Within 2 aircraft were being recovered again. The Big E refused to stop fighting. But the kamikazes didn't stop either. Day after day, they came, sometimes in 1s and 2s, sometimes in swarms. The Enterprise's gunners shot down dozens, but no defense was perfect. On May 14, it happened again. Another suicide plane slipped through the screen. This one struck near the ship's island, exploding against her deck elevator. The blast ripped open her flight deck, sent burning debris raining down into the hangar below, and killed or wounded hundreds. The explosion was so massive that witnesses thought she'd been destroyed. For hours, the crew battled fire and smoke. Power failed, communications went dead, and ammunition began to cook off in the heat. It was hell on the sea. When the fires were finally out, the Enterprise was a shattered wreck. Her once proud deck was twisted and broken, her elevator destroyed, her planes mangled beyond repair. The ship that had fought from Pearl Harbor to late Gulf was now crippled. And yet, she still refused to die. Even as she limped back to Ulithi Atoll for emergency repairs, sailors aboard other ships lined the rails, saluting her as she passed. The Big E had become more than a legend. She was a living symbol of endurance. When word of her damage reached Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz reportedly said, "The Enterprise has done enough for this war." But even he knew, if there was a way to bring her back, they would. The ship arrived at Pearl Harbor weeks later. Her scars were deep, twisted metal, burnt paint, a gaping hole where her elevator once was. But her spirit, untouched. The crews swarmed her decks with welding torches and cranes, patching, cutting, and rebuilding. They were determined to make her fight one last time. Then, before she could return to sea, the war ended. August 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The Pacific fell silent. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the Enterprise's engines were quiet. The battle stations were empty. The war was over, and the most dangerous American warship in the Pacific finally had peace. But even victory couldn't save her from what came next. When the guns went silent, America's massive wartime fleet suddenly became a burden. Ships that had carried the nation through its darkest hours were now too expensive to keep. The new age of jets and nuclear power was dawning, and the great carriers of World War II were being retired, scrapped, or sold for parts. The Enterprise, with her battle stars and scars, was decommissioned in 1947. Her crew disembarked for the last time. Many wept as they walked down the gangway, knowing they were leaving behind not just a ship, but a home, a piece of living history. She was placed in reserve, stored like a ghost in a quiet harbor. For years, veterans and historians campaigned to preserve her as a museum, a monument to the men who fought the war at sea. In 1958, after years of neglect, the Big E, the most decorated ship of World War II, was sold for scrap. Steel that had faced Japanese bombs and kamikaze fire was cut apart by torches and melted down for peacetime industry. To those who served aboard her, it was a heartbreak. Admiral William Halsey, who had commanded her in some of her fiercest battles, once said, "When they took the Enterprise apart, they took part of the Navy's soul with her." And yet, her legacy refused to fade. Every sailor who served aboard her carried her spirit forward. The courage, the resilience, the refusal to give up even when the odds were impossible. When a new generation of American warships was built, the Navy made sure her name lived on. In 1961, a new ship was commissioned, U.S. Enterprise, CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. She bore the same name, the same call sign, and the same fighting spirit as her predecessor. And just like the original, she would go on to make history, from the Cold War to the Persian Gulf, carrying the name Enterprise into the modern era. But even among all her successors, none ever quite matched the legend of the World War II original. The Big E wasn't just the most dangerous American warship because of her weapons. She was dangerous because of what she represented, the unstoppable determination of a nation that refused to surrender. She fought in 20 major battles, sank or helped sink 71 enemy ships, destroyed nearly 1,000 enemy aircraft, and survived damage that would have sunk any other vessel. No other carrier in any navy has ever matched that record. Her name became synonymous with victory, and her story, the story of courage in the face of annihilation, became part of the Navy's DNA. Today, fragments of her steel remain preserved in museums, her bell displayed with honor, her legacy carried forward in the ships that bear her name. When sailors today hear Enterprise, they think of more than just a ship. They think of an idea, one forged in fire and carried on the backs of men who refused to let her die. She was and remains the most dangerous American warship of World War II. Because danger isn't just about firepower. It's about never giving up, no matter what the sea throws at you. It's about surviving what should have been the end, and coming back for more. And no ship in history ever did that quite like the USS Enterprise. Years after the Big E was gone, her legend still echoed across oceans and generations. Veterans who had once stood on her decks would gather in small towns and big cities, remembering the days when they were young, fearless, and fighting aboard a ship that felt invincible. They spoke of her not as a vessel of steel, but as if she were alive, as if she breathed through her engines and spoke through the thunder of her guns. When storms struck, she steadied. When bombs fell, she burned but refused to break. When all seemed lost, she fought harder. To the men who sailed her, she wasn't just a carrier. She was home, she was destiny, she was America's answer to despair. They remembered the smell of salt and smoke on her flight deck, the whine of aircraft engines rising like a hymn before battle, and the strange, almost sacred silence that came just before the first explosion of combat. Those moments burned into memory, defined a generation. Even now, her name carries weight. When the next USS Enterprise, CVN-80, is commissioned, she will carry the DNA of all those who served before. Every weld, every rivet, every deck plate will whisper the same story. That greatness is not built from strength alone, but from sacrifice, unity, and courage that refuses to die. It's easy to measure a warship in tons of steel or numbers of guns. But the Enterprise can't be measured that way. Her true power lay in the hearts of her crew. Young men who laughed, cried, and fought together under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Men who patched flight decks with their bare hands, who launched planes off smoking runways, who stood shoulder to shoulder as the sky rained fire. The Big E's life was short, just a few years in a long history of war and peace. Yet she left an imprint deeper than any ship before or since. Her courage helped save the Pacific. Her survival inspired a nation. Her victories helped shape the outcome of World War II. And perhaps that's why, when people today speak of the most dangerous American warship of World War II. They don't think of the biggest battleship or the most advanced destroyer. They think of a single aircraft carrier, wounded, burned, and unbreakable, that changed the course of history. She was forged in the darkest days of 1941, rose to glory in 1942, and carried a generation's hopes across a vast, violent ocean. Her enemies called her the ship that would not die. Her crew called her the greatest ship they had ever known, and history remembers her by one name, USS Enterprise, the Big E, the heart of the Pacific War, the ship that refused to sink, the most dangerous American warship of them all.